The life of William Shakespeare, possibly the most well-known writer of all time, is mysterious. People have obsessed over it, and some have even questioned whether he actually wrote the plays attributed to him. Others have created wonderful fiction based on the information we have about his biography. But why do we know so little about Shakespeare? Shouldn't there be texts and documents that record the life of such a prolific writer? And why are people so obsessed with this information, or lack thereof, to the point of developing theories or writing fiction about it? Well, to get some answers, I read books by Shakespeare scholars, academic articles, and I even investigated some of the conspiracy theories surrounding the authorship of his plays. And of course, I read Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which focuses on elements that seem to have been overlooked when analyzing Shakespeare's life. But can anything meaningful be written about Shakespeare's family when we know even less about them? I know, so many questions. So let's start with the most controversial one. Did Shakespeare even write the famous plays? To be or not to be William Shakespeare? Not much is known about William Shakespeare's life in comparison to more contemporary authors, but we do know that he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564. His father, John, was a successful businessman who made gloves. He participated in local politics and eventually became the town bailiff. The family's prominent position probably meant that William attended Stratford's grammar school. As I mentioned, a couple of hundred years ago, some people, including some notable figures, began to question Shakespeare's authorship. They received the name of anti-Stratfordians, and they frequently argued that the son of a glove maker couldn't have had the education necessary to write the famous plays, such as the insider knowledge of court life or precise details about Italian society. In the article, The Authorship Question, or Will the Real William Shakespeare Please Stand Up? I love it when academics bring out the fun titles. Jenny Joy LaBelle, who was a professor of English at Caltech, argues an Elizabethan grammar school would have provided an education roughly equivalent to a modern bachelor's degree in classical literature. Latin was the principal subject taught. Thus, the implication that Shakespeare was an uneducated country boy is very probably wrong. Regarding the adult life of Shakespeare, we know that in 1582, when he was 18, he married Anne or Agnes Hathaway. She was 26 and already expecting their first child, Susanna. Then, in 1585, the couple had twins, Judith and Hamnet. There's barely any information about this period of Shakespeare's life, but it was the time when he moved to London and started his career in the theater. In Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare, James Shapiro, professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University, explains the lack of information. Shakespeare did not live, as we do, in an age of memoir. Few at the time kept diaries or wrote personal essays. By the time that popular interest began to shift from the works themselves to the life of the author, it was difficult to learn much about what Shakespeare was like. Now that those who knew him were no longer alive, the only credible sources of information were letters, literary manuscripts, or official documents, and these were either lost or remained undiscovered. The thing is, the authorship of Shakespeare's plays wasn't questioned for almost 200 years after his death. The debate actually began in 1785, when James Wilmot, a clergyman and scholar educated at Oxford, decided to visit Stratford-upon-Avon and the area to look for Shakespeare's books, papers, or any document related to his work. However, he wasn't able to find anything. And eventually, that led him to believe that someone else had written the plays, because surely the real author of the greatest plays of all time should have left some evidence for us to analyze, right? Besides the lack of documents, controversy has arisen from the data that we do have. James Shapiro explains. No less inscrutable is the contested will to which the dying Shakespeare affixed his signature in 1616. The surviving 3-page document makes no mention of his books or manuscripts. So, for the people who were convinced that the son of a humble glove maker could have never written plays such as Hamlet or Macbeth, who had done it? The man who started the theory, James Wilmot, proposed Sir Francis Bacon as an alternative, and some people believe this to this day. However, Professor Labelle argues, Bacon is not known to have had any connection with the theatre or any experience in playwriting. He was indeed a writer and a man of enormous erudition, but his philosophical, legal, and political tracts, often in Latin, bear no similarities to Shakespeare's plays. As the literary scholar George Lyman Kittredge pointed out years ago, if Bacon wrote Shakespeare, then Shakespeare or someone else wrote the works of Bacon. As many scholars signal, and I agree with them if it wasn't clear enough, there's no serious evidence to attribute the plays to anyone other than Shakespeare. We might not know a great deal about his life and career for the reasons mentioned earlier, but we know far more about him than we do about most writers of his time. And yet, no one is questioning the authorship of their works. So, why? History and fiction. If you're enjoying this video so far, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe. I am very close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, which would allow me to monetize the channel to continue making videos. So thank you. Well, we've analyzed the authorship question. However, we haven't answered what is at the core of this issue. Why are people so obsessed with William Shakespeare's life? Regarding this, Professor Labelle explains. Why has Shakespeare, more than any other author, attracted so many doubters? Nobody produces volume after volume of who really wrote the plays of Thomas Middleton, Cyril Turner, or a host of other Elizabethan and Jacobean playwrights about whose lives we know less than we do about Shakespeare's. Claims that someone else wrote his plays began in the early 19th century. This was the same period in which bardolatry, the worship of Shakespeare as a transcendent, almost superhuman genius, also began. So, with the rise of recognition, came also a rise in interest and scrutiny. Sometimes this has led to theories that question Shakespeare's ability as a writer. Other times, it has sparked a quest to find the clues that affirm Shakespeare's authorship. But some people have expressed this interest in the form of fiction, because no one is writing best-selling books or filming Oscar-worthy movies about Thomas Middleton. But many people are doing that about Shakespeare, because the myth of a man of humble origins who was capable of creating some of the most notable pieces of literature of all time is incredibly fascinating, especially when so little is known that it leaves so much room for the imagination, allowing an intriguing play between history and fiction. Hamnet. Novels that reimagine the lives of historical figures from an unusual perspective have risen in popularity in recent decades. Some scholars refer to this subgenre as new historical fiction. These texts don't strive for historical accuracy. On the contrary, they focus on the experiences of people who have been marginalized in mainstream history, and they often explore the past while considering contemporary interests. Well, Maggie O'Farrell had a very contemporary interest in the marginalized figures of William Shakespeare's life. Her novel Hamnet centers on Shakespeare's family, particularly on the tragedy that fragmented their lives. The death of 11-year-old Hamnet, the son of William and Agnes. I want to clarify that, unfortunately, I haven't been able to watch the adaptation yet because it hasn't been released where I live. However, I'm very excited for the movie. I've cried every time I've watched the trailer. Agnes is the protagonist of this story, a woman who, throughout history, has been represented in a not-so-positive light. For as long as Shakespeare's life has been studied, scholars have speculated that he despised his wife. And I insist, speculated because, again, there is no conclusive information to confirm this. Regarding this, Maggie O'Farrell told The Guardian, "We're fed this idea that she was an ignorant peasant strumpet who tricked this genius boy into marriage and he hated her and he had to run away to London to escape. Where is this coming from? Well, misogyny. People have assumed that because William married young when Agnes was pregnant, he must have been forced into the marriage. However, this theory doesn't make any sense because Agnes didn't marry the world-famous writer. His career hadn't even started yet. Actually, Agnes's family, the Hathaways, were prosperous farmers, giving her a substantial dowry. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust establishes. While Shakespeare's father's finances were on the decline, Anne's families were on the rise. This, combined with the fact that Anne was average age for marriage at the time, meant she was quite the catch. Additionally, people affirm that since William and Agnes lived apart for a significant period, their marriage must have been unhappy. There is, again, no sufficient evidence to prove this. And O'Farrell subverted this discourse and imagined a story in which Agnes and their children were the center of Shakespeare's devotion. And the reason she didn't move to London with him was to protect the health of her young daughter Judith. Regarding the common beliefs about Agnes, O'Farrell also said, "Yes, she probably was illiterate because what daughter of a sheep farmer in the 16th century would have been taught to read? There would have been no purpose for it, but illiteracy isn't the same as being stupid." To vindicate her, O'Farrell constructed a character deeply knowledgeable about the natural world. In the novel, Agnes cultivates herbs that she uses to cure people, she has a special bond with animals, and she even has the ability to predict certain elements of the future. I think this clearly connects her with the image of the witch in the early modern period. During this time, women who engage in healing practices were vulnerable to suspicion of witchcraft. In a context of scarce formal medical care and growing mistrust from male-dominated institutions such as the church and emerging professional medicine, women's knowledge and authority could be reframed as dangerous. We see this in the scene when a physician visits the Shakespeare home as Judith falls ill. Hamnet realizes he sees with the cutting clarity of a child poised to enter manhood that this man doesn't like his mother. He resents her. She sells cures, she grows her own medicines, she collects leaves and petals, bark and juices, and knows how to help people. This man, Hamnet suddenly sees, wishes his mother ill. She takes his patients, trespasses on his revenue, his work. Speaking of witches, isn't it funny that Maggie O'Farrell wrote a novel about the plague, literally the subtitle of Hamnet, and then as soon as she published it, COVID started? What an elaborate marketing strategy. And witchery is not only present through the figure of Agnes. Magic infuses the narration style with a lyricism that unveils the whimsy in everyday life. For example, O'Farrell writes, "If Agnes was lifted from the forest floor to that mother's back, she could nestle under the cloak of hair. The trees appear then, to her, through dark skeins, like a lantern show. Look," the mother said, "a squirrel," and a reddish flourish of tail disappeared up a trunk, as if she herself had conjured it from the bark. And this feeling, this bond between a child and their parent, is at the heart of the novel. Because Hamnet is a love story. It captures the innocence of falling in love for the first time and the wonder of conceiving a child as a result of a deep bond. He feels his face curling into a smile. A child, made by him and Agnes among the apples in the storehouse. This child in Agnes's belly will change everything for him, will free him from the life he hates, from the father he cannot live with, from the house he can no longer bear. He and Agnes will take flight to another house, another town, another life. But the story also depicts how loving someone can destroy you. The death of Hamnet breaks the family and even the structure of the book, which shifts from chapters to mere fragments. However, O'Farrell invokes the healing power of art. When the Shakespeare marriage is on the verge of collapse, Agnes attends a performance of Hamlet, and she understands this. Her husband has brought him back to life in the only way he can. As the ghost talks, she sees that her husband, in writing this, in taking the role of the ghost, has changed places with his son. The obsession with the bard. So, returning to the question of why people obsess over the scarce facts that we know about Shakespeare's life, either to create crazy theories or to write beautiful fiction, I would like to cite Professor LaBelle. She writes, "If whoever authored the plays was one of the greatest minds who ever lived, then how could have been a mere commoner? I think people try to look for an explanation of how a person with probably little resources, especially compared to an average contemporary author, could write such transcendental pieces of fiction. In Hamnet, I don't think Maggie O'Farrell tries to construct a veridical William Shakespeare. There's very little evidence about what he was really like, so that would be kind of pointless. Besides, the name William Shakespeare is never mentioned in this book, and that signals that the focus was on everything that surrounded him, which is a fresh perspective in a world obsessed with the bard." O'Farrell said, "I remember reading a lot of biographies of Shakespeare then. They're fairly hefty works, you know, they're maybe 400 or 500 plus pages, and I was really amazed that Hamnet the boy maybe got, if he was lucky, 2 mentions. They mentioned he was born, and they mentioned his death." It seems that in all of the discussions about Shakespeare's life, all the search for clues about the authorship, in all the desperate efforts to prove that someone from the nobility had written the plays, in all the overanalyzing of the facts about his life, no one, or very few people, actually considered the significance of the details we do know about his family. But Maggie O'Farrell did, and because of that, she created a beautiful story. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time, and see you soon.